In a quiet English village, strange whispers began to rise from ancient stones on a hill. Whispers not of ghosts, but of old grief waiting to be understood. Welcome to the series of Driftaway Tales. I am your host, Elias. If you liked our previous videos, please show your interest and support for scientific mysteries by subscribing the channel. Let's begin the story. Chapter 1. The Whispering Field. The stones did not speak at first. They only stood, ancient, weather-worn, half-sunk into the quiet earth of Rowanford village. Tall as doorways, narrow as graves, placed in a gentle ring atop the meadow hill. Generations had passed beside them. Children once played hide-and-seek around them. Shepherds once leaned against them to rest. And yet no one in Rowanford would go near them now. Not after nightfall. Not alone. Miss Marple noticed this on her very first evening. She had arrived not for a case, nor for holiday, but because Dr. Lydia Fetch had written to her. "Come stay a week. There's something here I think you should see, though I cannot explain it in writing." Miss Marple respected Lydia's mind. The young archaeologist was precise, thoughtful, and never spoke nonsense. So Miss Marple arrived, suitcase in hand, coat buttoned neatly, hat tipped just enough against the soft country wind. Rowanford was a gentle place. Crooked lanes, old hedgerows, apple orchards heavy with scent. It was the kind of village where life moved at the pace of bread rising. But as Miss Marple walked from the station to Lydia's cottage, she felt it. Something in the air was listening. When she greeted villagers in passing, they smiled, politely, cautiously. Conversation stayed near the surface. Weather, livestock, the coming harvest, fair. And to each person she saw, Miss Marple asked the same question in her kindly, innocent way. "What a lovely view of the meadow from here. Do you ever walk up to the old stone circle?" Every answer was the same. A pause, a quick breath, a polite change of subject. That was the moment she knew Lydia had been right to send for her. That evening they sat in Lydia's small study, a warm room of books, pressed flowers, maps, and careful handwriting. Lydia spoke first. "You heard it, then?" "No," Miss Marple said. "Not yet, but I saw the way the village is avoiding hearing it." Lydia nodded. "There were whispers once, folklore, that was all. But now?" She looked toward the dark window pane, where fields lay silent beneath the dusk. "Now the whispers are real." Miss Marple waited. Silence is sometimes the only invitation a troubled heart needs. "At night," Lydia continued, voice low, "if you stand near the stone circle, you hear voices. Not echoes, not the wind playing tricks. Voices that sound as if they are remembering something that happened long ago." Miss Marple folded her hands lightly. "Do you believe it is imagination?" Lydia's eyes, steady and unwavering, met hers. "No, I believe the stones are holding something, and lately they have begun releasing it." Night fell soft as wool. Miss Marple and Lydia walked to the hill, guided only by the moon. The grass glowed pale silver, and the air carried a faint scent of apples from the orchards below. The village lay behind them, windows dimming one by one, as though sleep were a tide rising slowly across the land. The stone circle waited ahead, motionless, watchful, older than anyone could name. The moment they stepped within its boundary, the air changed, not colder, not warmer. Just aware, Lydia stopped, hands tightening at her sides. "Listen." And Miss Marple did. It came first like distant footsteps, too soft to be real, too close to be imagined, not walking on grass, not walking on soil, a sound like someone stepping through memory itself, then a breath, a sigh, a whisper not of words but of emotion, something sad, something unfinished. Something waiting. Miss Marple did not flinch. Her life had taught her that the greatest terrors in the world are rarely supernatural. They are emotional things we have not yet understood. The whispers swept gently around the circle, as if moving from stone to stone. Miss Marple placed one gloved hand on the nearest. It was cool, but not dead, like a hand that once knew warmth and was trying to remember how. "What do you hear?" Lydia whispered. Miss Marple closed her eyes. "I hear," she said slowly, "something left unresolved, something that has not been allowed to rest." Lydia's voice trembled. "A ghost?" "No," Miss Marple said. "Something older than a ghost, a memory shaped by grief and held by stone." The wind shifted. The whispering grew faint, then faded, then was gone. The night returned to silence. They walked back slowly, neither speaking for a long time. When they reached Lydia's gate, Miss Marple paused, eyes thoughtful, but not afraid. "My dear," she said softly, "if grief is strong enough, it does not vanish when the mourner is gone. It settles like dust. It clings to places. And some places, especially ancient ones, know how to hold it better than others." Lydia exhaled, shaken but relieved to not be alone in this strange knowing. "And if that grief is waking again?" "Then we must find," Miss Marple said, "whose grief it was, and why now." She looked back over her shoulder to the hill, where the stone ring stood silent, pale under moonlight. It looked almost like a circle of people standing together, listening, watching, waiting. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but firm with certainty. "Someone in this village has stirred an old sorrow, and the stones are only repeating what they were taught." And with that, the mystery began. Chapter 2. The Stone That Listened. Lydia's cottage was quiet the next morning, sunlight falling through the kitchen window in slow, honey-colored beams. Miss Marple sat with a cup of warm tea, watching the steam drift like thought. Lydia stood at the map pinned to her wall, a hand-drawn sketch of Rowanford, marked with circles, notes, and dates. "These are the old records of the stone circle," Lydia explained. "I've traced references back nearly 600 years. Farmers recorded gatherings here, weddings, seasonal feasts. A place of community," she hesitated, "but also a place where quarrels were settled." Miss Marple nodded. "A place where strong feelings happened, joy, sorrow, conflict. Emotion leaves residue where it is nowhere else to go." Lydia turned to her. "Do you really believe stones can remember?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "My dear, memory is not only in the mind. Old houses remember the families who lived in them. A garden remembers kindness. And a stone, especially one that has stood through centuries, remembers what the world has pressed into it." Lydia folded her arms thoughtfully. "Then whatever happened up there was not small." "No," Miss Marple said. "And if the stones are speaking again, then someone has returned to the memory." A knock sounded at the cottage door, gentle but urgent. Thomas Hall stood there, the village schoolteacher, jacket slightly wrinkled, concern written openly across his face. "You both should come," he said. "Something has happened at the stones." They climbed the meadow hill again, the grass still damp with morning. As they approached, they saw Eleanor Rowan, the widow who kept the far orchard, standing near the stone ring. Her shawl hung loose around her shoulders, and her eyes were red as though she had not slept. Thomas whispered, "She's been here since before sunrise." Miss Marple approached quietly, not to startle her. "Good morning, Mrs. Rowan." Eleanor's head lifted slowly. "I thought if I stood here long enough I might hear him again." Miss Marple did not ask who. She did not need to. Eleanor looked at the stones with a grief that had ripened into habit. "My husband died 3 years ago, but sometimes on nights when the moon is high, I hear his voice, not calling to me, not words, just the feeling of him." Lydia drew in a soft breath. "You come here often?" "Since he passed," Eleanor whispered. "This was where we first met as children, where we promised we would build our orchard, where we argued, where we forgave." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "Yes, of course. A place of memory, a place of emotion, a place that could hold." Eleanor continued, voice trembling. "I know he's gone. I know, but when the whispering starts, it is the closest thing to hearing him breathe again. Light, soft, sorrowful." Eleanor covered her mouth, shoulders shaking. Thomas looked stricken. Lydia stared, scientific mind unable to classify the sensation. Miss Marple listened. And she understood. The whispering faded again, leaving the air still, heavy, waiting. Miss Marple spoke first, her voice kind but clear. "Eleanor, my dear, you are not imagining this. Your grief has not misled you, but what you are hearing is not your husband's spirit. It is the memory of your love and your sorrow, held here, where both were once strongest." Eleanor's eyes filled. "Then I caused this." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "You awakened it." Lydia stepped forward slowly. "If grief can awaken memory in stone, then perhaps peace can quiet it." Thomas frowned. "You mean we can teach the stones a new memory?" Miss Marple smiled, warm as morning bread. "Exactly so." Eleanor wiped her eyes, voice soft. "But how?" Miss Marple glanced around at the ring, at the grass, at the sky. "Not with force, not with ritual, not with fear. Stones are like people. They listen best when spoken to kindly." Lydia's expression sharpened with realization. "If emotion imprints, then we can imprint calm, gratitude, gentle conversation, shared warmth." Thomas nodded slowly. "We can change what this place remembers." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Yes, but not today. First, we must learn whose grief began the first memory, who quarreled here, what wound was never healed." Eleanor closed her eyes, breathing steadily now. "There was a feud," she said, quietly, "long before I was born, between my husband's family and the Rooks." Thomas looked troubled. "The Rooks still live at the village edge, and they still carry the echo of that old anger," Miss Marple said. She looked to the stones. "And the stones have carried it, too." They walked back down the hill, slowly, not defeated, but aware, the kind of awareness that grows roots. As they reached the lane, Miss Marple spoke thoughtfully. "Stones do not choose what they remember. People choose, and people have long memories when they are hurt." Lydia nodded. "So the first step is learning the story." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "We must understand the wound before we can close it." Thomas exhaled. "The Rooks are not easy people." "No one is," Miss Marple replied gently, "until they are understood." Behind them, the stone circle stood still and silent, for now, but the air around it seemed to watch, as though it knew Miss Marple would return, because this mystery was not of ghosts, nor magic, nor superstition. It was a mystery of memory, of emotion, of what happens when sorrow has nowhere to go but into the earth itself. And Miss Marple, who had solved countless puzzles of the human heart, knew exactly where to begin. She would start where all old stories hide, with the ones who still remember. Chapter 3. The Forgotten Quarrel. The Rook cottage sat where the village began to forget itself. Not unfriendly, but inward-facing, hedges grown tall, windows curtained even in daylight, a gate latch that clicked like a final word. Miss Marple, Lydia, and Thomas walked up the narrow path, while crows circled the barn roof, calling in short, dissatisfied bursts. It was a place shaped less by welcome and more by endurance. Mrs. Rook opened the door before they knocked, not from hospitality, but because she had already seen them coming. She had the posture of a woman who had held her own life together by hand-stitching its edges, tight and without thread to spare. "Well," she said, eyes moving from one face to the next. "Which of you is ill?" "No one is ill," Miss Marple replied gently. "We are here because of the stones." At that, Mrs. Rook's shoulders stiffened. Thomas shifted his weight. Lydia kept her silence, as scholars do when the moment is fragile. Mrs. Rook stepped back just enough to allow entrance, not invitation, but acknowledgment. They followed her into a front room that smelled of lavender and polish, where every object sat exactly where it had been placed years ago and dared not move. "You've heard them too," Mrs. Rook said flatly, pouring tea she did not intend to drink. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and we believe the stones have remembered something painful, something that belongs to this village, something that has not yet healed." Mrs. Rook's hand tightened on the cup. "It's not the stone's fault," she said, voice brittle. "It's people who carve wounds into place and then pretend time will bury them." Miss Marple nodded, soft sympathy in her eyes. "And if a wound was never spoken aloud?" Mrs. Rook swallowed once. "Then it echoes." The silence in the room gathered itself. Mrs. Rook sat down, her movements careful, as though she were sitting beside a memory rather than a chair. "It began before my time," she said slowly, "when my grandfather was young. The Rowans and the Rooks were neighbors then, good neighbors, even friends, worked the same meadow soil, traded cider, shared seed stock." She stared at her hands. Then the drought came. Lydia listened with the stillness of someone preserving every word. Fields dried, wells sank low, and the Rowan well, the one by their orchard, it kept giving water when others did not. No one understood why. The Rooks begged to share it. The Rowans refused. Thomas looked stricken. "But Rowanford is so gentle now. Hard to imagine." "Hard things don't vanish," Mrs. Rook interrupted. "They just go quiet," she continued. "One morning your Eleanor's great-grandfather went to the stone circle to confront my grandfather. Words were spoken, terrible ones, and they say the Rowan man struck the first blow. Some claim my grandfather struck back harder. No one knows the truth anymore, or perhaps no one wants to." Miss Marple nodded. "But the stones know." "Yes," Mrs. Rook's voice broke, "because the fight happened there, in that ring, and one of them never came home again." Lydia's breath caught. "Someone died?" Mrs. Rook nodded once. "The Rowan man." Thomas closed his eyes. "And my grandfather," Mrs. Rook said, voice so quiet it seemed it was remembering itself, "never forgave himself. But he did not forgive the Rowans either." Miss Marple leaned in, kind but firm. "That is the memory the stones are repeating. Not the fight itself, but the grief that followed." Mrs. Rook's eyes glistened. "You think the whispers are mourning?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "they are asking to be released." They left the cottage and began walking back toward the village green. Lydia was silent, deep in thought. Thomas walked slower than usual, as if absorbing a lesson not taught by books. Finally, Lydia spoke. "Emotion as in print. Trauma stored by environment. I've read papers suggesting seismic vibrations can encode sound fragments into porous minerals, but..." She shook her head. "This is not physics alone. It's something human." Thomas spoke quietly. "What do we do now?" Miss Marple watched the stones. "We must do what grief never allows on its own." Lydia raised her eyes to her. "And what is that?" "We must let the past be spoken gently, so it may finally rest." They visited Eleanor next, carefully. Her orchard was a place of soft golden light and fruit-sweet air, but grief lingered there like a second season. Eleanor was pruning branches, movements steady, eyes tired but determined. She didn't look surprised to see them. "You spoke to the rooks," she said simply. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and we know what happened now." Eleanor set the pruning shears down. "I don't hate them. I never did. My husband didn't either. But the story was passed to us, and we carried it, even when we didn't mean to." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Grief can be inherited, my dear, like land or stubbornness or fear." Eleanor looked toward the hill. "And now the stones are bearing it for us." "They bore it because we were not ready to," Miss Marple said softly. "But we are ready now." Eleanor's voice trembled. "And what do we do?" Miss Marple's eyes warmed, kind and certain. "We do not correct the past. We complete it." She placed her hand lightly over Eleanor's. "We will bring the rooks and the rowans to the stones, not to reopen the wound, but to close it properly." Eleanor exhaled, not in fear, but in relief that finally overtook her like sleep after many nights without it. "Then I will come," she said. And the orchard seemed to breathe with her. Miss Marple stood once more at the foot of the meadow hill, the stone circle waiting above like an unfinished sentence. The past had spoken, the truth had resurfaced. The sorrow had a name again. Now came the work that only the living could do. For memory is not a ghost, it is a story without an ending. And Miss Marple, with quiet steps and patient heart, was ready to write the ending it had always needed. Chapter 4. Patterns the Ear Forgot. Thomas Howe held the chalk like a conductor's baton and tapped the first stone, just a quick talk on the lichened dark face. The sound didn't ring. It folded in on itself as if the stone swallowed the note instead of letting it go. Miss Marple stood a little back, hat brim catching the gray light, while Dr. Celine Park knelt with her pocket meter pressed to the base. Lydia Reinhardt, skirt edged with mud and delight, traced an old carving, 3 shallow crescents, barely more than whispers in granite. "Again," Park said. "Talk." The needle nudged, then flattened, a graph of reluctance. "Same as the eastern stone," Park murmured. "Damped, like a drum with a thumb held on the skin." "Or like a person who's learned not to sing," Miss Marple said quietly. They were in the ring above the village 7 standing stones, and an 8th, broken and laid like a sleeping dog. The morning was bright in the way of honesty, all edges and no promises. Thomas pointed toward the fallen stone. "When we tapped that one, it answered soft but true, the upright ones. They hushed themselves." Lydia brushed dirt from the crescents. "These marks repeat," she said. "Here, here, and on the lintel at the chapel ruin. If they're a map, they're a map of listening." Miss Marple smiled with her eyes. "Then we must ask what deafened the rest." A low tremor felt more in the teeth than in the ear rolled through the hill. Park lifted her head. "There, subsonic, faint. From the quarry?" Thomas asked. "Perhaps," Park said. "But the quarry sleeps Sundays. This is nearer." "Under us." Miss Marple looked down at the thin grass, at the nettles holding their own at the edges, at the shy violets in the lee of stone. "Under us is the old culvert," she said, "where the spring used to run before it was given work and pipes. And where Mr. Gray went missing last winter," Thomas added, instantly sorry he had. They all stood a moment with that truth, respectful of its shape. "Let's not run ahead of the day," Miss Marple said. "Stones first, people after." At the chapel ruin, light slanted through a roof that had decided not to be one for a century. Pews were gone, but the faint authority of seating remained in the rectangles of moss. On the broken chancel step, Miss Marple found what she was looking for, a scatter of pale grit against dark slab, new enough to be boastful. "Fresh chisel," she said. Lydia crouched. "And their chalk," she breathed, pointing to a faint line that touched the alcove like a thought. "Not random," She stood and eyed the wall where the ombre had once been. This niche, someone measured it recently. See the scuff just here. A crate corner would do that. Thomas peered into the niche and inhaled dust. Why hide anything here? The whole parish comes to the ruin to flirt and carve initials. Because hiding in plain sight still works on people who prefer secrets too. Tidiness, Miss Marple said. What fits in a square niche with a chisel scratch for punctuation? Park's gaze had gone flat in the way of engineers doing sums. A box of core samples, she said. Rock cylinders. If someone was testing the ring, they'd drill discreetly, then cart the cores to study density. Lydia clapped softly. And if density varies, some stones ring, some swallow. Lithophones. Thomas blinked. Is that legal? Legal and graceful, Park said. Illegal is when you put the cores back as gravel and tell the grant committee you found nothing. She angled the meter toward the niche. Residual dust suggests granite and something else. Feldspar high. Could be our damping culprit. Miss Marple pinched grit between finger and thumb, then touched it to her tongue like a rickless saint. Salt, she said, smiling at their expressions. And a little iron. Someone salted the niche to keep damp off the box. Someone careful? The clerk? Thomas ventured. Lydia's pencil stopped. Or Sir Roland's director friend from the Geological Institute. He was very interested in our ring last year. Too interested. Miss Marple tucked the thought away. Let us be generous for one more day. The truth performs better without an audience. They followed the old spring line downhill, through hazel and hawthorn, to where the covert yawned iron-lipped and serious. Park set the meter against the grate. The graph rose like a cat's back, then settled to a purr. Consistent subsonic pulse, she said. Not natural. Periodic. If I were a criminal, I'd call it a compressor. Or a little pump that thinks too well of itself, Miss Marple suggested. Thomas squinted into the dark. Is someone using the culvert as a tunnel for sound? Lydia tapped her notebook. If you wanted to silence stones, you'd give them a contrary rhythm, enough to spoil their ring. A lullaby badly sung. Miss Marple's eyes softened. It is always the bad lullabies that make babies cry. They skirted the mouth and took the sheep path that led to the new power substation behind the hedgerow, a neat fenced square, humming like a polite insect. A contractor's van sat outside with the usual claims to reliability, painted on its flank. A man in a cap stood smoking, the uncertain posture of hired hands told to wait for orders that never arrive. Morning, Miss Marple said, like weather. He touched his cap. Afternoon, miss. Is the station recently altered? Park asked, as if admiring his gearbox. Just a booster on the feed, he said. Quarry pulls more when it starts at 6. We evened it out. Less surge. Neat work, Park said. It'll hum a bit, he allowed. But the cows at Cotter's number 3 ignored it, so we're right enough. Miss Marple smiled. Cows are impeccable jurors. She watched a starling go in at the eaves and come out with nothing, and the movement made a little clock in her mind tick once. When did you set the booster running? Last week, he said, and again last night on test. Midnight to 3. He flicked ash which missed his boot and found its way to regret. Thank you, Miss Marple said. You've given us back 3 hours we didn't know where to put. Back at the ring by tea time, they tapped stones again in the new stillness of afternoon. The fourth stone, which had swallowed sound in the morning, now gave a faint, clean tone. Park closed her eyes. Damping less. The pulse is intermittent. We've caught the ring during its rest. Lydia shaded the crescents with a leaf to bring them up. These carvings, if they mark the listening times, not places. Then we have a schedule, Miss Marple finished. The stones will speak when the hum sleeps. Thomas half laughed. "We could hold a concert. We could hold a confession," Miss Marple said. "But not ours." Chapter 5. The Map That Wouldn't Speak. By morning the village had learned a new way to be quiet, not sullen, but expectant, as if the hedges were holding a breath on someone else's behalf. Miss Marple set a saucer of cress on the sill of the borrowed cottage, and watched the first light touch the leaves. The room answered with an honest hush, no lurking harm, only patience. She tucked her tape measure into her bag and stepped out toward the church, where Dr. Celine Park had promised a demonstration, and Lydia Reinhardt had promised maps that remembered. They found the vestry table laid like a calm, industrious altar, 3 small metronomes, a compass, chalk, and cups of pens that looked like well-behaved raindrops. Lydia unrolled 2 surveys of the district, the parish tithe map, and a modern ordnance sheet. "Here," she said, tapping 6 circles in. "Pencil where stones ought never to have been. The churchyard yew, the lane corner with the subsided milestone, the pump by the school gate, the hollow near the mill, the thorned stile above the river, and the quarry lip beyond the beechwood. Each is where voices thin," she murmured, "and each lies on a line that refuses straightness, and yet arrives together, like beads threaded by a shy hand." Park set 1 metronome ticking softly, and moved it along the edge of the map. "If it wavers here," she said, "we will have found a place that dislikes regular beat." At the quarry mark the little pendulum faltered, stuttered, then recovered. Thomas Howe, who had come early with the tidy panic of a schoolmaster trying not to be in the way, whistled a 1-note test and felt his chest lose interest in the sound before it reached his mouth. "There, Miss," Marple said gently, as if greeting a small animal. "The stone is not singing. It is absorbing." They began with the churchyard yew, because good experiments start near home. Park chalked a half circle around the tree's base and placed the metronome on the stone curb. At 6 paces the tick behaved, at 3 it soughed. At 1 it became a thought of a tick. Lydia read a line from the burial register and found unexpectedly that the end of each sentence arrived without ringing in the ear. "There is no after-sound," she said, surprised at the absence. "Words simply stop." Reverend Armitage tried the Lord's Prayer and discovered it ended modestly, like bread rather than brass. Not unholy, he decided. Unambitious. Miss Marple noted the direction of the yew's lean, the alignment of stones that had shifted their shoulders together over centuries, the way the air felt settled rather than stale. She touched the trunk, then withdrew the hand as one withdraws a question that has already been kindly answered. "The tree has learned to be an ear," she said. "We must be careful not to mistake listening for consent." They moved to the lane corner where the milestone had sunk into ditch sleep. Park held the metronome at knee height, then at shoulder, and frowned when both faltered in the same way. "Not a draft," she said. "A volume." Miss Marple stepped into the hollow and spoke her name. It landed like a coin placed on velvet. "A place that cools sound," she said. No echo to heat it again. Lydia circled the mark on her map. "If the old track crossed here at dusk," she murmured, "messages might need a second telling. Or none." At the school pump, Thomas gathered pupils to serve as small, cheerful meters. 1 at a time, he warned, and felt pleased when they obeyed without needing to be important about it. Park placed the metronome on the pump's flange. The children, taught to whistle politely, and never into grown-up ears, took turns. Near the spout, notes behaved like proper visitors. At the base where stone met earth, the sound shortened. "It's like a missing chorda," one girl said, clever without boasting. Miss Marple asked them to clap once together and to listen for the room's reply. There wasn't one. The clap arrived and ended and left no footprint. The children looked uncertain, then pleased. then curious in the steadier way that learns rather than performs. "We shall keep our clapping for the yard," Thomas said, delighted with a rule that sounded less like rule than like taste. Mrs. Harrow came by with the afternoon's ordinary news and watched Park tilt the metronome against the iron and the flagstones. "The well never liked a fuss," she said. Perhaps its stones taught the pump to be dignified. She took the handle once, found the punctuation of the stroke less eager for echo than she remembered, and smiled at the bucket as if approving a literate child. Miss Marple was pleased with the small vocabulary that a village can use. Without meetings, dignified pump, listening ewe, velvet ditch. She wrote them in a column on Lydia's margin so that they would feel like citizens. The quarry, when they reached it, had the look of a creature caught halfway between sleeping and remembering why it had meant to wake. Its lip was a clean bite out of the beechwood. The floor below held pooled rain that tasted of old argument and lime. Park set a pin flag at the outer rim and one at the inner. The metronome sat on the flat of a fallen block and clung to its tick at the edge, then faltered as she inched it toward the void. Thomas tried his. One note again and felt it sag, as if the quarry were drinking it without malice. "Absorption coefficient," Park said softly. "High. The geometry returns nothing. This is where voices come to finish and decline to return." Lydia knelt and blew across the lip. The air made no flute, only a minor correction to dust. She rummaged in her satchel and produced a rubbing of the Roman milestone fragment she had found last week in the rector's shed. "This stood on the old road," she said. "The inscription ends mid-title. No withering, just stopped. It could be a stone-cutter's mercy or a quarry's habit." They walked a slow arc around the rim, Miss Marple counting paces as shared arithmetic, Park adjusting the metronome's tempo downward until even the slowed beat found itself shorten. "It is not dislike," Miss Marple said. "It is appetite. The stone eats endings. In a place like this, a promise would sound like a fact. A threat would sound like silence. A confession perhaps like forgiveness if one were disposed to hear it that way." They sat on the beech roots and shared the sandwiches Lydia had meant for lunch. No one tried to be clever. The quarry made cleverness unnecessary. When they rose, the beech shed a leaf. It fell without rustle, a demonstration of thesis. By the time they returned to the vestry, the afternoon had decided to be honest evening. Sir Rowland Keene and his thin clerk waited with a polite lack of entitlement. "Report?" he asked, not without humility. Park unrolled Lydia's map, now pricked and penciled and annotated. Listening ewe, velvet ditch. Dignified pump, unambitious prayer, hungry quarry. She set the metronome ticking near the door, then pushed it along the table until it reached the quarry mark. It dared 2 ticks, then soft, then stopped with a good grace. "What does this mean to a ministry?" Miss Marple asked, because men tire less when you write their question for them. "That you must not stage speeches here. That a frightened witness cannot be heard at the quarry lip. That assembling men to shout will produce the comfort of being unable to hear themselves and the danger of believing they have been quiet. Also," and here she glanced at Park and Lydia, "that the absence of echo is as measurable a sign as the presence of song." Sir Rowland's mouth did the small thing it does when a penny lands exactly into the right pocket. "Post benches," he said, surprising himself with the correctness. "Do not build rostrums. Discourage meetings that prefer noise to meaning." He looked at the clerk, who had already written bench. "Maintenance, twice. And teach surveyors not only to hear hums, but to notice hush." Miss Marple touched the map at the quarry mark and felt the way one feels a freshly laundered collar, the rightness of the day. "Tomorrow we will visit the mill hollow and the thorned stile," she said. Places that cool words may also cool anger, if introduced properly. And somewhere in all this, the missing voice that began our trouble will step out of the shade and tell us what was not said. Park closed the metronome's lid. Lydia folded the maps as one folds linen. Thomas wrote practice silence. Measure hush on the chalkboard beside please stacked chairs. Armitage opened the vestry door and let the river's evening come in as statute. Miss Marple took her saucer of cress from the sill and smiled at its plain progress. We have found the map that wouldn't speak, she said, and taught it to tell us where things go to end. Now we shall ask very politely what ended here and for whom. Then she blew the lamp low so that truth, which prefers twilight to glare, could find its way without stumbling. Chapter 6. The Ledger of Fault Lines. The stones received them as they had the first night, without echo, without courtesy, like a room that refused to acknowledge guests. Dr. Celine Park planted her tripod in the turf, set the small recorder to gain high, and began her quiet ballet of dials. Thomas Howell chalked a pale ring around the central capstone, then marked 12 little ticks like a crude clock. Lydia Reinhardt stood with an oilskin folder, the wind tugging at its corners as though even paper wanted to leave. Reverend Armitage held a hurricane lamp low, so the circle's shadows would not be commanded. Miss Marple waited a pace outside the ring where listening has longer legs. Park struck the tuning fork and let it kiss the air at tick 6. A silver note sprang up and vanished, as though swallowed by wool. She moved to 9, the same swallowing. At 12 a thin remnant remained, the ghost of a sound that should have lived. Not uniform, Park murmured. A lopsided null. The absorption lines up along a diagonal. Like a seam, Miss Marple said softly. She crouched and pinched a thumbful of soil. Feel this? Dry as manners at a budget meeting. She turned her wrist. The dust fell in a sulky ribbon. And here, 2 steps left, the turf keeps. Last night's dew. A fault not in the earth only, in the behavior of the earth. Thomas, delighted to be useful, drew a line through the chalk clock, connecting the dead positions. Lydia overlaid her vellum site map and nodded. If the old quarry plan is true, she said, this diagonal would have carried carts and later pipes. Park moved the tripod along the line. The recorder's meter barely stirred. Either a hidden cavity under the diagonal, she said, or a dense plug that drinks sound like bread drinks gravy. Both would explain the silence, Miss Marple answered. Only one explains the theft. They looked at her. The lamp hissed. Somewhere beyond the hedge a fox trod on dead leaves with the courtesy of velvet. Morning brought them the stonemason, Mr. Davy Craddock, whose hands looked like 2 intelligent rocks that had learned to behave. He stood inside the circle only after touching his cap to the tallest men here. Granite-faced, sandstone-hearted, he said, tapping the capstone with his knuckles. The tap came back thin. Your silence sits under you. Bed's odd here. Should be good ring in this weather. Miss Marple guided him to the chalk diagonal. Here? He stamped with the practiced gentleness of a man who loves what he kicks. Hollow. A run-o' spoil, maybe, or an old culvert. There was talk of a drain when the quarry boomed to keep the floor from soup. If any man knew proper, it'd be Caleb Druitt Foreman, now retired and half-soured. Lives up by the lime kilns. Druitt, Lydia repeated. He signed the ledger I found in Finch's shop, CFD, in the margin, and the entry for Moon Hour. Her face lit. I thought it a fancy. Perhaps not. Moon Hour? Thomas said. What would one buy at Moon Hour? The privilege of not being heard, Miss Marple said. They walked Davy to the stile and thanked him with the sincerity men who work with stone deserve. Park remained behind and tilted the recorder's mic at the turf, thumb fine-tuning until the meter fluttered. then lay down on her coat and placed her ear to the ground like a child. "There's a breath here," she called up. "Not wind, slow, a room where air has been keeping itself company." "A chamber," Miss Marple said, "or a run large enough for a man with small morals and a smaller lantern." Park sat up, grass in her hair, delighted. If someone opened a trap in the old culvert during the moon hour, you could lower a crate, speak, and never be heard above. The circle would drink your whisper. "Not your whisper," Miss Marple corrected, eyes on the hedge gap that faced the road. "His," she pointed. "Finch's boy sometimes arrives on a bicycle that doesn't arrive. One hears the bell before and after, never as he passes. He chooses this gap. Men repeat the tricks that saved them once." Caleb Druitt's cottage looked as if it had turned its back on the quarry and been forgiven for it. He opened the door with the careful timing of a man who expects debt or the law. Miss Marple, whose gift was to look like neither, stood small on the stoop and asked for the kindness of his memory. He barked that he had little of it left, then poured it any way men do, if they are asked by someone who knows the names of old tools. "The culvert," she said. "Aye," Druitt grunted, and his resentment softened into the relief of a chronic confession. "Cut it when the pumps failed. Run under the floor o' the south bay and out below the hedge. Rubbish went down lucky as sinners. We boarded the mouth when water sobered." "Did anyone reopen it?" Lydia asked, feigning ignorance with the delicacy of a librarian handling moth-eaten pages. He looked at the horizon instead of at them. "Heard a rumor," he said. "Somebody playing games. Night work. Told the constable. He told me to quit my echoes." "Who?" Park asked. Druitt shook his head. "I see men by the way they carry rock, not names by how they carry letters." Then, after a beat, "Finch would pay for silence if he couldn't buy it," he muttered. "But he'd never dirty his shoes. He'd send a bird." Miss Marple thanked him and left a packet of tea on the sill-piece for a man who had told the truth and didn't like how it felt. As they walked away, Reverend Armitage said, "A bird?" "An errand boy," Miss Marple said. "Or a chore boy with a bicycle bell that rings everywhere but here." Thomas frowned. "Pembroke's boys?" "Not the choir master," Miss Marple replied. "He loves the echo too much. He would never be party to borrowing all of it." She looked toward the lane. "But the boy with the zinc pail and no father to ask questions of Evan Snipe. He runs for Finch, and for anyone who pays on time. They tried the trap at dusk. No warnings, no threats. Information wants quiet," Miss Marple said. "We will show it silence and see who brings it their secrets." Park and Thomas lifted the turf along the chalk diagonal, where the ground wore its thinnest expression. 2 feet down, Park's trowel struck wood not rotten enough to be forgotten. She cleared a square old planking, tar-streaked, with a ring bolt sunk like a boiled eye. "Don't pull it yet," Miss Marple said. She set the recorder running, then poured a cup of water along the join. The planks drank like men who had been right all day. "A seam," she said. "Great kindness. It will hold in place if someone expects to come up through it, and not whistle the village awake." They waited. The circle darkened to its excellent self. On the road beyond the E and the Inung hedge, a bicycle bell chimed twice to no effect, then once, as if striking a bargain with its own echo. Evan Snipe slid through the gap with the careful speed of boys who have learned not to be noticed. He knelt where Miss Marple had knelt, but with greed in his knees, and felt for the ring bolt without looking, as if his fingers had been there last week. Park, from the shadows, could hear his breath. The recorder, aimed at the planks, could not. Miss Marple stepped forward, small and absolute. "If you lift that, Evan, do mind your posture," she said. "Back straight. The dead weight of stolen things has no respect for spines." He froze. Then he chose bravado, poorly. "It's just old boards," he said. "I like wood." "Caleb Druitt liked it first," Miss Marple said, "and Mr. Finch liked it more. Tell me, did he send you to fetch the ledger you hid for him, or to lower another crate of stones he pretends are legal?" The boy's eyes tried to be both cunning and young. Youth won. "He said keep the room quiet," Evan muttered. "He said the circle does the rest." "Not the room," Park said, stepping into the lamplight. "The diagonal under your knees. A culvert that drinks sound because it carries it away. You have been using a drain as a safe." Evan looked at the hedge. Sir Roland Keene, who had installed himself there with a magistrate's sense of the right moment, stepped through with a thin clerk in tow. "Enough," Sir Roland said, not loudly. "The shopkeeper can have his hour in court. The boy will have a bench and a book." "2 benches," Reverend Armitage said. "One for the boy, one for every man who thought borrowing a village's voice was a clever trick." They did not open the planks that night. Miss Marple would not allow the circle to be made into a public throat. "Tomorrow," she said. In daylight, with courtesy, she looked at Evan, whose bravado had dropped like a wet coat. "You will stand with us, and you will show us the ledger, where it is, and who paid for the moon hours." He nodded, very small. "Does it matter?" he asked, in the desolate way boys do when they discover grown-ups are merely older boys with bigger pockets. "It matters who thinks silence is theirs to rent," Miss Marple said. "And it matters who learns to hear again when the hole is closed." They walked into the vicarage, where Sister Birch appeared as if summoned by the smell of trouble, and offered a cup and a chair and the kind of look that improves posture. Park packed her instruments. Thomas dusted his chalked hands. Lydia wrote CFD equals Caleb F. Druitt. Moon hour gives culvert higher. Finch intermediary. Snipe runner. Sir Roland signed something under the lamp. The clerk wrote no loudspeakers in the margin out of habit and conviction, and the night laid itself down at last. On the green the stones resumed their refusal to echo, and for once it felt like dignity, not theft. Miss Marple put her palm against the capstone, as one rests a hand on an old horse. "Tomorrow," she told it, "we'll return what is yours, the right to decide when to be silent." The stone said nothing, which was finally the proper answer. And beneath, where wood covered dark, a little breath of air made a sound like someone who has kept a secret long enough and is ready at last to exhale. Chapter 7. The Pattern Beneath the Earth. The storm that had promised spectacle never arrived. It only pressed its palm to the village and listened. Miss Marple stood at the quarry lip with Dr. Celine Park, Lydia Thomas, and Reverend Armitage while Mr. Roper checked the wooden wedges he'd sunk into the faulted slate. Below, the terrace of standing stones wore last night's drizzle like a sober shine. "No wind, no. Birdsong," Thomas whispered. "It's as if the air is holding its breath." Park raised the pocket seismograph. Its needle rested in polite attention. "Good. If anything hums, it won't be weather." Miss Marple, hat tilted at an angle that suggested she and the hill were in committee, tapped her cane twice on the ground. 2 faint answers returned from the terrace pause. Answer, pause. "There's your stutter," she said. "Not random. Something beneath is speaking in a habit." Roper wedged a short oak plank under the largest stone. The one with the spiral pecked like a whispered instruction. "No cracking," Miss Marple called down. "We don't remove its voice to prove it had one." Roper nodded, eased back. The stone settled, a dignified elder, unwilling to be hurried. Park laid 3 contact microphones along the slope, one near the spring seep, one at the terrace edge, one on the flattest capstone. The needle shivered 3. Ticks, long pause, 2 ticks. Lydia's eyes widened. "The same pattern we found in the graver's ledger, 3 cuts, rest, 2 cuts." Armitage folded his hands. "A prayer," he murmured, "or a metronome for patience?" Miss Marple glanced toward the far hedge where Sir Rowland stood respectfully back. "Or a warning?" "Let's ask, and this time let the earth finish its sentence." They ran the simplest test first. Park set a clay bowl in the seep's thread of water and dusted chalk across the surface. Chalk would show the first touch of motion. Thomas counted a steady 5 in his head. Miss Marple lifted her cane, held it, and set it down. The chalk snapped into 3 tiny spokes, paused, formed 2 more like the hands of a clock, deciding to be clever. "Subsurface resonance," Park said, but the words were kinder than the syllables. She traced a rectangle in her notebook. Terrace, seep, buried void. Her pencil hovered. "A gallery," Lydia offered. "If there's an old hollow under the stones, even a narrow one, trickles could drum a pattern for centuries." Armitage looked down the slope where the old blackthorn hedge knelt, and the villagers would tidy their days to match it without ever writing a rule. Sir Rowland stepped forward, tie unassertive, voice low. "If there is a hollow, there may be collapse." "You'll take no risks," Roper snorted. "I take only the right ones." He passed Thomas a wax crayon. "Mark your chalk on that capstone concentric rings, then hum your tally at it. Not loud. Stones hate shouting." Thomas hummed a gentle note. Miss Marple had named yesterday human middle. No heroics. The chalk rings rippled once, obedient, then stopped. Park's microphone heard, answered, then silence. "They prefer the earth's voice," Miss Marple said. "So would you if you were stone." Lydia knelt at the pecked spiral and brushed rain from the groove. "Look at the wear," she breathed. "Not from water hands. Generations tracing this line to remember something. Not writing, not art instruction." She turned to Miss Marple. 3 turns, rest, 2 turns. "The pattern is everywhere you attend long enough." They needed a map of the unseen. Park unrolled a slender cable with a coil at one end. Her poor woman's subterranean harp. She pushed the coil into a fissure, laid the cable along the terrace, and connected it to the seismograph. "We'll tickle the fault with very low current, then listen to the return. If there's a void, the echo will be lazy." Roper frowned. "No burning?" "No burning," Park assured him. Miss Marple stood with her cane tip planted, eyes the color of thought. "If there is a chamber," she said, "we will not open it to cure curiosity. We will open it only to let it keep speaking without harm." Sir Rowland nodded, surprised to find that sentence easier to defend than any memorandum. Park pulsed the coil once every 10 seconds. The needle drew calm, then a soft sag, then another like someone seated shifting their weight to stretch a cramp. She pulsed again. The sag repeated. 3 slight surrenders, pause. 2. "That's not fracture," Park said. "That's volume and air space, perhaps long, perhaps narrow." Lydia's breath made mist. "An ancient drain? A ritual crawl space? A path for spring water to run under the terrace and out toward the field?" Armitage smiled. "Or a choir loft for the smallest hymn." Miss Marple put 2 fingers to the nearest capstone, as if addressing a shy child. "We hear you," she said. "We won't make a fuss," the stone answered with a tremor that might have been geology and might have been manners. "Mark a safe line," Roper said. With string and pegs he drew a curve on the turf that matched the coil's soft confession. "No heavy boots inside this loop," he announced. The group obeyed as if the ground had put up a notice. Thomas laid small paper flags. 3 paws too. "We're turning a pattern into a path," he said. "Children will learn it in a week." Miss Marple proposed an experiment no instrument would have suggested. "If the chamber carries a tune, let us see what it prefers." She set 3 clay bowls along the marked curve. 1 above the seep, 1 mid-terrace, 1 near the hedge. Into each, Roper dripped water from a sheep's horn ladle he'd insisted on bringing for luck. Park raised a hand. On my count, no, on Miss Marple's. Thomas looked abashed and delighted to be disinvited from leading. Miss Marple looked at the sky, at its refusal to threaten, then nodded. Begin. Drip, silence, drip, silence, drip. The first bowl answered with 3 tiny licks, then waited. The second, slower, echoed 2 and fell still. The third did nothing, then gave a single, late ring, as if something far below had rolled over. Lydia clapped her hands once and then apologized to the air. "There is a bend," she said. The echo returned strongest at bowl 1, weaker at 2, delayed at 3. "The chamber isn't under all the stones, only along a ribbon," Park's graph agreed. Sir Rowland stared at the string curve as if it were a signature he almost recognized. "If the chamber runs toward the field," he said, "it may empty into the old culvert by the hedge." "And if it does," Miss Marple replied, "then the mysterious silence at the vicarage hearth, remember, is merely the chamber holding its breath when the culvert floods. Your ministry can mend a culvert. You cannot mend a story carelessly broken." He smiled without meaning to. "Then we mend carefully." Armitage knelt and read a short line from the Psalter. Not a spell, a sentence about listening to stones. They were not Christian stones. They were older and entirely themselves. Still, they consented to be companions. Miss Marple rested her palm on the spiral, then withdrew it as if she had just agreed on terms with a polite solicitor. "We won't lift you," she said to the capstone, "unless leaving you would hurt you more." They made their way down to the hedge where the culvert's mouth showed its cracked lip. Roper knocked it with the respectful contempt of a craftsman viewing a lazy repair. "Collapsed 6 feet in," he judged. "Water backs up under the terrace in heavy rains, sings in the chamber to keep from sulking." Park crouched, ears intent. "We fix the outflow. The chamber keeps its dignity. The stones keep their song without drowning their sentence." Sir Rowland pulled off his jacket and, to everyone's educational shock, fetched a shovel from the car. "Then we clear it," he said. "Under supervision." "They did, but not as heroes," Roper directed. Thomas shifted silt. Lydia kept the spoil to one side like a librarian shelving honesty. Armitage steadied the hedge. Park measured the return. Sir Rowland learned to say snug, not proud. Miss Marple counted softly. 3. Paused 2 until the water, freed, answered in its own timing, and slipped outward beneath the field with the relief of a corrected clause. The terrace breathed. The needle on Park's instrument made a small, satisfied bow, and settled. At sunset they returned to the capstones. The spiral no longer shone with rain, but with the sort of memory people earn. Park tapped one bowl. The ripple traveled outward only, as physics politely recommends. "The silence," Lydia sighed, head tipped, "is no longer a wall. It's a space kept for meaning." Miss Marple smiled. "And we will keep it kept." She looked at Sir Rowland. "You may publish the culvert repair. Spare the chamber its fame." He nodded. "A footnote, then. Outflow restored. Pattern unbroken," Armitage added. "And benches on the quarry lip." Thomas laughed. "For people who wish to hear without speaking." As they left, a thrush tried a phrase, failed it cheerfully, tried again. The stones did not approve or disapprove. They simply continued. Miss Marple paused at the string's first peg and pressed it into the turf more firmly. "There," she said, to ground, to friends, to history. "We have learned enough for one day. Tomorrow we will practice not knowing until the earth volunteers another sentence." The terrace held its peace, no longer a secrecy, rather a courtesy. And beneath, along the ribboned hollow, the water slipped through with its own quiet grammar, intact 3. Pause. 2 so that any ear patient enough could remember the village's lesson. Meaning is not in noise. It is in rhythm kept. Chapter 8. The Night the Village Listened. The evening was one of those rare English evenings that seem to have remembered summer by accident. Soft air, a sky fading like tea diluted by cream, and the faintest scent of apples warming in orchard dusk. Yet Rowanford was uneasy, as if each door and window hesitated before allowing night inside. Word had already drifted slow, careful, village shape that something hidden beneath the stone circle had been found. People did not know what it was, nor how it mattered, only that the stones had not been haunted, but interrupted. Miss Marple and Lydia walked the lane together. The hedgerows shivered not with wind, but anticipation. "They're frightened," Lydia murmured. "But they don't know of what." "Of the idea," Miss Marple replied gently, "that the past is not finished with them. People always believe the past has politely died just because they have stopped mentioning it. And has it?" Lydia asked. "No," Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. "It simply waits for someone kind enough to listen." They reached the green, where several villagers stood in small shapes of worry. Mrs. Harrow twisting her apron, Mr. Rook leaning on his cane, Eleanor Rowan clutching a shawl that did not need to be clutched. Reverend Armitage waited by the Lychgate lantern ready. Miss Marple stepped into their center, not as authority, but as permission to breathe. "We will go to the circle," she said quietly. "Not to summon anything, not to question, only to listen together. The stones have held the memory alone for too long." No one argued. They followed her up the meadow path as twilight settled, calm, slow, inevitable. The stone circle was a silhouette against a violet sky, each stone tall as an old story. Thomas had arranged benches, 3 of them, placed not as audience seating, but as gentle reminders to sit before judging. Park's equipment lay silent, packed away. Tonight, listening was human work. Miss Marple stepped to the center knot within the chalk-marked diagonal, but just beside it, where her presence would not press upon the chamber below. "No one will speak loudly," she said. "No declarations. No explanations. We are here to let a memory finish being remembered." Eleanor stepped forward first. Her voice was thin but steady. "My family withheld water in the drought," she said. "We believed we were protecting ourselves, and a Rowan man died because of it. We never forgave ourselves, so we taught our children to be proud instead." Silence opened around her, deep but not cold. Mr. Rook's cane tapped once. He took his place opposite her. "My grandfather struck first," he said. "We pretended he didn't. We built a story to sleep easier. We handed that story to our sons. It soured everything it touched." The two stood facing one another, not as adversaries, but as tired inheritors of an argument neither of them began. Lydia's breath trembled. Park looked down, jaw tight, not with judgment, but with the ache of witnessing something long overdue. Reverend Armitage spoke, only one sentence. "We remember now so that the stones no longer must." A breeze rolled lightly through the meadow. Then came the sound, not faint, not loud, something between. A whispering like breath passing through leaves, like rain remembered, like footsteps softened by time. 3 pulses, a rest, 2 pulses. The same pattern the earth had been repeating all along. But now there was a difference. It was not sad any more. It was gentle, patient, finished. Eleanor covered her mouth, not in fear, but in relief that undid her shoulders. Mr. Rook bowed his head, not in shame, but in release. Thomas closed his eyes. Lydia's did not, because she wanted to see memory becoming peace. Park let her hands fall open at her sides. Armitage breathed a prayer with no words at all. Miss Marple simply listened, and the pattern slowly softened. 3. Pause. 2. Then one final pulse, a closing bracket. A full stop, the meadow exhaled, and the whispering ceased. Not abruptly, not like something lost, but like something completed. The villagers did not leave right away. No one wanted to break the new silence by filling it. Instead, they sat on the benches Thomas had placed. Eleanor and Mr. Rook sat beside one another, not touching, not speaking, but sharing space. Park stood with Lydia at the edge of the terrace, speaking softly about stone density and resonance patterns, but their tone was not academic, it was reverent. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on knees, letting stillness settle into his bones like a lesson learned without chalk. Reverend Armitage began pulling small weeds from the circle's edge, not out of tiding, but out of caretaking. Miss Marple walked once around the ring, lightly trailing her glove along a stone's surface, not claiming it, but acknowledging it. When she returned to the benches, Sir Rowland arrived up the path, not striding, but approaching slowly, respectfully. He removed his hat. "Is it done?" he asked quietly. "No," Miss Marple said. "Nothing important is ever done, but it has begun to rest, and that is enough for one evening." Sir Rowland nodded. He did not look at the stones. He looked at the people. "They will need a new memory," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, smiling warmly, "and they will make one." Together, on the walk back down to the village, no one spoke louder than the wind. Children who had not been told any of what happened played near the lane with a kind of gentleness, as if they simply knew the world was softer now. Lamps glowed warmly in cottage windows, doors opened without hesitation. The church bell did not ring, it did not need to. Miss Marple paused once more and looked back at the hill. The stones stood exactly as they had yesterday, and yet everything had changed, not because they had been solved, not because secrets had been uncovered, but because grief had been allowed to finish speaking. Lydia slipped her hand into Miss Marple's arm. "You always know," she whispered. "No," Miss Marple said kindly. "I simply listen longer than most." They walked home through the quiet that was no longer heavy. It was simply quiet, and now, finally, the village could rest. Chapter 9. The Pattern Beneath the Floor. The vestry's flagstones held the day's last light like coins on a plate. Miss Marple stood in the doorway while Thomas knelt with a stick of chalk, sketching the plan Lydia had reconstructed from the church archive: a ring under the nave, a spur toward the lich gate, and one blind corridor under the chancel. Dr. Celine Park set down a velvet-lined case of tuning forks, each stamped with a neat frequency. "If the stones keep a silence," she said, "it may be tuned." Sister Birch arrived with a thermos, Sir Rowland with a face that tried to be background, and Mr. Roper with 2 mallets and a grin that belonged to midnight repairs. "Begin at the cracked slab," Miss Marple murmured, "the one that always goes quiet after evensong." Park struck a 440. The note floated, courteous, then thinned to nothing. She tried a lower fork. The sound kissed the floor and vanished. Thomas stared. It swallowed it. Roper rapped the same, placed with his knuckles. A dull thump, then a soft ring from somewhere else, 2 slabs over. Lydia read from a margin note she'd copied. "Where the stone grows tired, speak softly and listen beneath." Miss Marple traced a chalk line farther. "The silence doesn't sit. It moves like a fox run," and for the first time Sir Rowland leaned in, not to control, but to hear. They laid out a grid with coins and pinheads, labeling each slab with letters. Park struck C-D-E in sequence. Thomas, eyes bright, called the decays. At H3, the fork winked out again, no echo, no tail, while at J2 the tone lengthened, no sweet as a hymn held one breath too long. "A baffle," Park said. "There's an air void or chamber under here narrow, curved." Roper swapped mallet for a carpenter's brace and slid its thin bit into cracked mortar. He didn't drill. He listened, cheek near the handle. "Hollows west," he said, "and lower than you'd think." They shifted to the chancel. The blind spur Lydia had inked on Thomas's plan ran under the choir stalls, ending at the old stone sedilia, 3 carved seats worn by centuries of patience. Sister Birch ran her palm along the seat edge. "Smoothed by people who didn't need to speak," she said. Park tapped again. The fork trembled once and died. Silence rolled down the spur like a draft. "Didn't drill," he listened, cheek near the handle. "Hollows west," he said, "and lower than you'd think." They shifted to the chancel. The blind spur Lydia had inked on Thomas's plan ran under the choir stalls, ending at the old stone sedilia, 3 carved seats worn by centuries of patience. Sister Birch ran her palm along the seat edge. "Smoothed by people who didn't need to speak," she said. Park tapped again. The fork trembled once and died. Silence rolled down the spur like a draft. "Follow the draft," Miss Marple whispered. They traced it to a dark, forgotten iron ring sunk flush with stone beside the sedilia. Its slot was choked with candle wax fossil. Roper scraped gently. The ring twitched. The silence thickened, as if waiting. "Before we open anything," Miss Marple said, "we agree. We do not hurry what's meant to rest." Park nodded. Sir Roland, to his credit, said nothing at all. Roper and Thomas eased the ring. The stone lifted a hair, then settled again with the sigh of an old cushion. Beneath lay an air-black gap and a smell of cool dust. Park lowered a tiny inspection mirror, caught a slice of geometry, arched brick Roman, Norman, and a narrow run curving beneath the nave toward the lich gate. Lydia exhaled. "A resonance gallery," she said. "Not to carry sermons louder, to carry them away." Sister Birch poured tea for courage that would not shake. "A drain for sound," Thomas whispered, enchanted. "So quarrels wouldn't accumulate, so grief could go somewhere safe." Miss Marple sat on the nearest pew, as if to welcome a guest. "Then our stone's silence is not emptiness, it is housekeeping." Park smiled despite herself. "An acoustic culvert," she said, "where energy is absorbed and returned as nothing. Your mystery is elegant." Sir Roland tugged off his gloves and crouched, peering into the ring's dark. "Can it fail?" "It can be blocked," Park replied. "Wax, silt, pride." Roper tapped the ring's rim with the mallet, not to loosen, to greet. A faint answering hush came from the gallery, like a cat turning once in sleep. They tested the gallery without disturbing it further. Park placed a low speaker 3 pews back, set to murmur a steady, gentle tone. She measured at the ring. The tone arrived and thinned, then collapsed exactly where the chalk spur ran. She shifted the speaker to the porch. The gallery took that sound, too, swallowed, and softened it. Thomas clapped once at the door. Within the nave it was a clap. Beneath the ring it was a breath. "Someone built a kindness," Lydia said. "A way for heavy words to be carried off." She opened her folder to a sketch from 1712 workmen, paying out rope along the nave stones, the caption, "Laying the quiet run." Miss Marple's eyes warmed. And when rumors soured, when grief overfilled, the floor remembered where to put it. She turned to Sister Birch. "In the infirmary, the bench was our teacher. Here the floor is." Sir Roland stood, dust on his knees and humility in his voice. "We must not museum this," he said, surprising himself. "We must use it." Park pointed at the wax-choked ring. "Light clearing only, nothing structural," Roper agreed. "Snug, not proud," he muttered, already selecting a spoon as reverently as a surgeon choosing a scalpel. Miss Marple touched the sedilia's edge. "And we'll teach the village a small ritual. When words grow heavy, bring them to the stones, and let the floor keep them quiet." They ended with a rehearsal that was not performance. Armitage, fetched from the vicarage, stood before the sedilia and read not scripture, but particulars of an ordinary day. A child's fever down, a debt forgiven, a letter late and then not. Park set the tone low and human. Thomas, at the porch, spoke a single sharp sentence, the kind that could have become a rumor, then bowed toward the ring and fell quiet. The sound moved into the floor and did not return. Lydia wrote a single line for the parish book. "This place is built to listen. Let it." Sister Birch pinned a note at the lich gate. "If you cannot keep a quarrel, give it to the stones." Sir Rowland, already thinking in grants and benches, said softly, "We'll publish the gallery as method, not marvel." Miss Marple watched the nave breathe. The silence no longer felt like absence. It felt fitter well for sound. She looked at Park. "Tomorrow we clean the ring and teach the path. Tomorrow we clean the ring and teach the path." "And the day after," Park said, "we measure the village again." "Not to prove," Miss Marple smiled, rising, "to remember." Outside, the moon balanced on the lich gate. The stones kept their quiet as a promise, and the night, pleased to be relieved of certain duties, grew lighter by the exact weight of what the floor had chosen to carry. Chapter 1. Oh, the chamber that listens. The door gave way not with a creak, but with a sigh, the sort old stone makes when it recognizes good manners. Miss Marple, lantern shaded in her gloved hand, stepped into the chalk passage first, then Dr. Celine Park with her compact instrument case, and finally Lydia, with folded maps that had learned to behave in wind. Behind them, Thomas kept the coil of rope neat. Reverend Armitage murmured a line of caution that was not quite a prayer. The air cooled by degrees, until breath became a small white punctuation in the dark. "Smell that?" Park whispered. "Limestone and stillness. No cut odor, no recent disturbance." Miss Marple tilted her head. The hush here was not emptiness. It was event. A low, constant quiet that suggested the hill itself had learned to listen. Remember, they will prefer courtesy to force," Miss Marple finished, eyes warm. She gave Thomas the tiniest nod. He extinguished his torch. Lydia trimmed the lantern to a calm amber. In the softened light, the chalk seemed to glow from its own patience. Thomas cleared his throat to speak, and Miss Marple lifted a finger. "Not yet," she breathed. "Let the room meet us first." A minute slid by like a careful boat. Somewhere far within the hill, a drop of water clicked, and the click took its time, becoming silence again. "Right," Park said, barely audible. "Trial 1. Quiet presence." She tapped the floor lightly with a rubber-capped rod. On the tablet screen, 3 lines rose and fell together, faint, clean, obedient to physics. She exhaled. Good baseline. Miss Marple moved to the chamber's rim and laid her palm flat on the chalk, the way one reassures an old cat. "We will not ask loudly," she told the stone. "We know you prefer the second telling." "Trial 2, Park said, producing a tuning fork and striking it with gentle authority. A pure tone shivered the air a below middle C, then faded. The sensors hiccuped, recovered, and drew neat decay curves like disciplined handwriting. "The chamber accepts a tone but doesn't prolong it," Park reported. "No overring." "Which is mercy," Lydia murmured, eyes on the rippled ceiling. "Rooms that cling to sound tell lies." Miss Marple's gaze had settled on the low side of the bowl, where tiny shell fossils dotted the chalk like a stilled star field. "If this hill were a listener first," she said, "what precisely has it been listening to?" "Wind, drip, footfall, ritual," Park answered. "And if our map holds, the path of sound from the barrow mound above." Thomas unpacked a threadbare length of cloth, a banner fragment Lydia had found stitched into a parish ledger, and laid it at the bull's center. Faded, blue, hand-worked spiral in gray thread. Found behind binding in 1799, Lydia said. The curate wrote old sign not to be burned. Park lifted a brow. And now we've brought it to rehearsal. Exactly, Miss Marple said. Trial 3, a human tone without words. They hummed soft and steady, the way people hum to calm a rabbit. One note held by many throats, not performance but making the air kind. The chamber answered not with echo, but with a gentler ease. The graph lines on Park's screen rose less sharply, sat back sooner, as if the stone preferred company to instruction. Armitage smiled into the quiet. In church we call that the room joining. Rooms do not join, Park began, and then stopped herself. On the screen a single narrow spike bloomed, delayed, singular. Not the frequency they had sung, lower, older. It pulsed once, then lay down. What was that? Thomas whispered. Trial 4, Miss Marple said. Eyes bright? No sound at all? They let the humming fall to 0 and held still. In the stillness a second pulse arrived quieter, the same ancient note. The chamber offered it and was done. Park rolled her shoulders. The hill is repeating an internal event, a drip at a tuned point. Or, Lydia touched the stitched spiral with 2 fingertips. Or a ritual you can't cauterize out of chalk. They ran the careful sequence again, so no imagination would be mistaken for method. Trial 5, Park said, pulling a small water bowl from her bag. If this is a listening space for stone, let's give it the other partner. She set the bowl in the dip, lantern behind it so a thin crescent of light lay on its surface. Thomas, a pencil tap, please, same as the vestry trials. Tap. The ripple moved outward and died honest, unadorned. The censers stayed calm. Now, Park said, we hum once, then silence. They did. The bowl's surface made a barely visible inward tremor, a borrowed courtesy, the old echo, then returned to obedient physics. On the tablet, the chamber gave its one low pulse again, as if ticking attendance. Consistent, Park said, relief and awe wrestling to a draw. The chamber keeps a memory of a single favored tone structure born, periodic, and different to us unless we overfill it. Indifferent, Miss Marple repeated, amused. Like a very old aunt, she raised the lantern a fraction and studied the rim. These marks, Lydia was already beside her. Chisel, she said, but not modern. A ring of shallow notches. Here, here, and here. She mapped them to the censers with her eyes. Celine, if this ring was meant to break some tones and pass one, could your pulse be the one they allowed through? Park's mouth quirked. A prehistoric bandpass filter? She set the tuning fork in the notch and struck it again, softer, precise. The pulse returned, cleaner. Whoever made this chamber, Armitage murmured, chose a single sentence for it to keep. Or a single silence, Miss Marple said. She put her palm back to the chalk, listening with skin. They built a grammar that refuses gossip. It retains only the note that announces rest. A scuff echoed from the passage, and everyone turned to the tiny, unhelpful sound of a shoe on chalk. Thomas lifted the lantern. Evan? He called. The echo returned without person. Then a crisp voice, don't fuss. It's only me. Sir Rowland Keene appeared, tie loosened, the thin clerk behind him, with an expression that had learned to be impressed. I had a feeling you'd find a room, Sir Rowland said, lowering his voice despite himself. Show me why we've been told not to wire speakers into caves. Park, now all method, replayed the sequence for them, letting Sir Rowland watch the graph learn humility. He did not interrupt. The clerk, to his credit, put his notebook away and folded his hands like a useful chore boy. When the single low pulse appeared the third time patient, sufficient, unpersuadable. Sir Rowland nodded slowly. You're telling me this chamber will not cooperate with instruction. It keeps one tone, its own, and that tone announces absence. Room at rest, Park said. It will echo almost nothing else. Miss Marple lifted the spiral cloth, and people who used it understood that. They built for restraint. When the village stopped understanding, the hill did not change. We did. We packed our voices where rest ought to go. Sir Rowland looked unexpectedly moved, not by romance, by clarity. Then our policy, he said, is to leave such rooms alone, record their refusal, and post a bench outside. Benches everywhere, Miss Marple agreed. Rooms like this teach us to take the air in proper measure. We don't need to take the room. A shiver nothing dramatic ran underfoot, like the hill settling a thought. Park glanced at the tablet. Minor ground pulse-likely, the spring waking time. They reversed themselves with care. Sensors up, bowl emptied, cloth folded, lantern lifted. At the threshold, Miss Marple touched the jam and said, "Not to be heard by anyone but Stone. Thank you for keeping the silence when we would not." Outside, dusk had collected itself into a deep blue kindness. Stars pricked the chalk-white edge of the barrel. The hedgerow held a small owl like a punctuation mark. Lydia blew out the lantern, and the hill's darkness felt trustworthy rather than large. Thomas inhaled, slow, exact. "We found the chamber that listens," he said. "We found the chamber that refuses to repeat us," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Which is rarer?" Sir Rowland put his hat back on as if acknowledging a verdict. "Tomorrow I'll wire the permanent secretary. No installations. Post seating. Publish restraint. Add, invite silence at the threshold," Armitage suggested, smiling. They started down, rope coiling back into Thomas's elbow in neat loops. Behind them the hill kept its one sentence, and only when all feet were on softer ground did Miss Marple say the line she had been saving all day. Stones do not mind being old. They mind being taught new noise. Park laughed, tired and bright. "And water?" "Water minds whatever we practice," Miss Marple said. "Tomorrow we'll teach the village how to listen outside the hill as well." The owl corrected a mouse with professional economy. The stars rehearsed the same lesson they had given every night and would continue to, unbothered by policy. The party turned toward the village, where kettles and benches and a well with decent manners waited, and the chamber behind them kept doing the impossible thing, guarding a silence so particular it could be shared, the one sentence the hill had always been willing to repeat. Chapter 11. The Day of Quiet Voices. The morning light came softly, like a house guest who knows where the teacups are. Roanford woke without hurry. Windows opened, bread rose. The pump at the schoolyard gave its first calm handle stroke of the day. The silence, once heavy, was now gentle present, but not demanding. It was noticeable enough that people paused between sentences, letting meaning settle like flour dust on a clean table. Miss Marple, Lydia, and Thomas walked toward the village hall, where benches had already begun to quietly gather, some brought by neighbors, some by Roper, some by Sir Rowland's clerk, who had developed a personal pride in bench placement. Eleanor Rowan and Mr. Rook arrived separately, but stood near the same window. They did not greet one another, but their distance was no longer barbed, merely shy. Reverend Armitage prepared the table where the listening practice would be taught, not a sermon, not a lecture, but something simpler, how to speak so that the stones would not need to answer any more. Dr. Celine Park adjusted a small wooden bowl of clean water at the center. The bowl was not symbolic, it was diagnostic. When the village spoke in anger, its surface had once rippled inward, shivering like a frightened animal. Now, as villagers filtered in and took their seats, the water remained still as resting breath. Miss Marple watched this with quiet satisfaction. "We are beginning," she said. "Not finishing, beginning." When the hall had settled, Miss Marple stepped forward, not at the podium, but among the benches. She had no notes, no script, no gestures designed to impress. She simply stood the way a grandmother stands when about to explain something that matters. "We have lived," she began, with a silence that frightened us, though it meant only to help. "The stones on the hill and the chamber beneath the church have been keeping what we would not face, sorrow that was never spoken, anger that was never confessed, grief that had nowhere to rest. People listened, not politely, but fully. We believed the silence was punishment," she continued, "but it was only waiting for us to learn how to speak differently." Lydia stepped forward with the old stitched banner, the spiral sewn in gray thread. She held it loosely, like a memory passed down carefully. "This symbol," Lydia said, "is not a command. It is a practice. It means 3 breaths before speaking anything heavy. Then speak. Then 2 breaths to let meaning settle." Thomas demonstrated awkwardly, but sincerely, 3 quiet breaths, a single sentence. "I am afraid of repeating old harm." Then 2 breaths more. No one laughed. Even children tried it solemnly, with the seriousness of those who understand ritual better than adults ever admit. Dr. Park spoke next, voice calm and almost shy. "Stone remembers vibration. Water remembers shape. Soil remembers weight. And people remember everything that hurt them, unless shown how to put it down." She pointed to the bowl. "When we speak from fear, the water ripples in. When we speak from peace, it ripples out." She demonstrated with 2 simple sentences. "You always forget me." The water trembled inward. "I would like to be remembered." The water moved outward, soft as a petal. A hush moved through the hall. It did not frighten anyone this time. Then it was Eleanor's turn. Her hands trembled only a little. "My family kept the well during the drought," she said. "We believed we were right. We believed protecting our own was fairness. We were wrong." She did not look at Mr. Rook. She simply spoke to the room. "My grief taught me to speak only after everything was already lost. I would like to speak sooner now." The water moved outward. Mr. Rook rose not like a man in court, but like a man stepping out of a coat that had been too heavy. "My family struck first," he said. "We pretended we didn't. We allowed that lie to carry us for generations." He set the cane aside. "I would like to carry less weight." The water did not ripple at all. It simply rested. This was enough. No embraces, no apologies, no dramatic reconciliation. Just 2 people who had stopped adding to the inheritance of pain. Reverend Armitage nodded once and said, "Let us go to the stones, not to fix them, but to thank them for holding what we could not." The villagers followed, not in procession, but in companionship. Children walked beside elders. The wind moved softly through hedges that had listened for too long. The path to the hill felt shorter than it had in months. The stone circle was waiting, not alert, not ominous, simply present. Miss Marple placed the stitched banner at the center, atop a smooth stone that had never held carving. Lydia poured a small measure of water into the bowl beside it. Thomas set a bench just outside the ring, not inside, not upon, but near enough for presence, and far enough for respect. No speeches followed. Instead, each villager in their own quiet time approached a stone, laid a hand or did not, breathed 3 breaths, spoke a single true sentence, breathed 2 breaths more, and stepped back. Some wept, some laughed softly, some simply stood. The stones did not echo, the chamber did not pulse. The silence was no longer a memory asking to be remembered. It was peace doing its proper work. Even Mr. Finch, the shopkeeper who had once paid for silence rather than Patience stood with his jaw tight and eyes bright, and said a single sentence no one asked him to share aloud. Then he left the ring lighter than he entered it. Dr. Park checked the bowl. The surface remained calm. Sir Roland removed his hat, not as authority, but as gratitude. Reverend Armitage spoke the final line of the day, though it was more observation than benediction. Nothing has changed, and everything has. As they walked back, dusk folded around the village like a quilt that had been mended rather than replaced. Children ran ahead to the green. Dogs stretched in the last warmth of earth. Doors opened not cautiously, but as though welcoming return. Thomas lingered beside Miss Marple at the lich gate. "How did you know it would work?" "I didn't," she said kindly. "But I knew the village did not need to learn something new. It only needed to remember something old." Lydia slipped her arm through hers. "And what is that?" "That quiet is not emptiness," Miss Marple smiled. "It is space made for kindness." The bell did not ring that evening. It did not need to. The whole village was already listening. Chapter 12. The Echo That Stayed. The village did not wake differently the next morning. There were still kettles to boil, boots to tie, hens to coax and coax again. But the air was different, not quieter, clearer. There was room in it now. Room for breath that did not tremble, for thought that did not brace itself, for steps that did not hurry to stay ahead of memory. Miss Marple stood at Lydia's gate, gloves buttoned, suitcase modest as always. She was not leaving, not yet, but departure was beginning to form in the shape of the day. The village no longer required her to stay. Her tasks had been careful, almost invisible. A question here, a tea there, a bit of silence placed where silence could help. "Everything is in motion," she murmured. Lydia joined her, notebook tucked under her arm. "The stones are still quiet," she reported. "Dr. Park says the chamber's pulse runs softer now, steady, as sleep, consistent, unforced." "Good," Miss Marple smiled. "We have asked the hill to remember only rest." Thomas came hurrying down the lane, not panicked, but eager. "You must come," he said. "You need to see this. The children, they've done something." Miss Marple lifted an eyebrow. Children often do. They followed him toward the schoolyard. What they found there stopped Lydia mid-step. The old pump, which once answered the handle with a stiff, grudging clank, now stood adorned with 3 ribbons. Not bright, not gaudy, but soft-colored scraps of worn fabric, blue, gray, and pale green. The children had tied them loosely, not decorating but signifying. Beneath them, on the ground, the children had drawn a circle of chalk, not perfect, simply round enough to be welcoming. A small wooden sign leaned against the pump. The lettering was uneven, but the meaning was clear. "If you feel heavy, sit here. 3 breaths. Speak once, 2 breaths, then go play." Miss Marple's eyes warmed, not with sentiment, but with recognition. Children had understood what adults had taken decades to forget. Peace is practiced, not discovered. The schoolmistress, Mrs. Thorne, approached from the steps, wiping chalk dust from her hands. "They did it themselves," she whispered. "I only provided the chalk." Thomas beamed. "They even told the younger ones not to shout into the pump. The pump works better if we talk kindly," they said. Dr. Park arrived moments later, instrument strap slung across her shoulder. She didn't take readings. She didn't need to. When she saw the pump, she simply put a hand over her heart. "It wasn't science that finished this," she said softly. "No," Miss Marple replied. "But science helped us listen." Later that afternoon, the villagers gathered one last time at the stone circle, not to investigate, not to demonstrate, not to settle history, simply to be there. There was no formation, no order. People sat on grass, leaned on stones, stood with hands in pockets. A few children braided clover stems. A dog slept with its head on its paws. Eleanor, Rowan, and Mr. Rook sat 6 feet apart, not close, not distant, simply level. Reverend Armitage did not bring scripture. He brought a bench. He set it just outside the ring and sat down. That was all. The gesture rippled not through air, but through posture. Others sat. Others softened. No speeches came. None were needed. The silence was not the old silence, not the one heavy with unsaid grief and inherited blame. This silence had weight but no burden, shape but no edge. It felt like a hearth after the fire has gone gentle. Miss Marple closed her eyes and listened, not to sound, but to the absence of distress. The earth beneath the stones was quiet. The chamber beneath the church was quiet. The water in the bowl by the lich gate was quiet. But Rowanford itself, its breath, its living, was not quiet. It was peaceful. Peace makes sound. Just a different kind. Sir Rowland found Miss Marple at the boundary of the stone ring as the sun began to descend along the orchard's ridge. "You have done a substantial thing here," he said, but gently, as one acknowledges a truth rather than awards it. "Oh, not I," Miss Marple replied, almost amused. "The village already knew what it needed. It simply needed permission to do it aloud." Sir Rowland considered that. "You believe the stones were not warning us, but waiting." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "waiting for the day when the living could take back their own sorrow and place it where it belonged, in memory, not in the air." "And now?" he asked. "Now the stones will remember rest instead of grief, and the village will remember how to remain gentle." Sir Rowland nodded. Something unarmored in his posture eased. He glanced at Lydia and Thomas, speaking with the school children, at Dr. Park brushing chalk from her fingertips, at Eleanor handing Mr. Rook a sprig of apple blossom, not reconciliation, but acknowledgment. "You'll be going soon," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple answered, "because I am no longer needed, but you will be missed," he said. Miss Marple smiled, small, private, fond. "That is different, and very kind." That night the village slept deeply. No whispering stones, no uneasy air, no memory that sharpened itself in the dark. The chamber beneath the church breathed like the slow pulse of roots. The stones on the hill stood like companions, not sentinels. And Miss Marple sat at Lydia's window, writing a single line in her small notebook. When silence is no longer feared, it becomes a home. She closed the book. No next mystery pressed upon her. No urgency tugged. Only the gentle knowledge that somewhere in some village some day there would be another silence needing translation. But tonight, here, quiet was enough. She folded her hands. She breathed 3 times. She let the peace settle. And Rowanford, for the first time in a century, slept without remembering sorrow. I am glad to see that you are still here. Please like Tia video and subscribe the channel to be part of this journey of scientific mysteries.